This is CinePunked. This episode meshes with Maya. I'm Robert J.E. Simpson. Spend enough time in cinematic dreamscapes and you will find yourself heading deeper into surrealism and the avant-garde. Within the work of filmmakers outside of a commercial studio-based system are bold experimentations and moments of pure cinema, pushing at the definition of the medium and introducing ideas which are frequently adopted by the mainstream. Among some of the most influential dreamscapes of the 20th century are the films of Ukrainian-born filmmaker Eleonora Deren, better known to the world as Maya Deren. Deren's Meshes of the Afternoon, 1943, and At Land, 1944, are silent, experimental films that play with our sense of reality and being. They present us with filmic experiences which are enthusiastically debated by students and critics even today. They tend to leave audiences in one of two states: bewildered or bewitched. Deren's films are films concerned with movement and dance and disavowing the laws of physical space and time. They are ritualistic, magical, and packed with beautiful imagery. They're also short. Maya's body of completed film work runs for significantly under 2 hours. Joining me today as we try and navigate our personal responses to Maya Deren's cinema is a new voice to the CinePunked podcast, but a long-time ally, Dr Paula Blair. Paula is a freelance creative who writes about film, the creative arts and visual culture. She has taught film extensively in universities around the UK and is the host of Audiovisual Cultures podcast. So if you haven't heard of it, go check it out and listen to more of Paula's brilliance. But Paula, thank you for joining us and welcome finally after many, many months of talking about doing this to CinePunked.
Thank you so much, Robert. I have been really looking forward to this. I love our chats and it's just a wee Incredibles reference there. And but I do, it's true. I love our chats. I love talking about all of this stuff with you, and it's really great to do it a bit more properly with the podcast recording and start what I hope will be years and years of wonderful collaborations.
I guess I just get the in right at the start. It's like, yeah, this is what I'm here for. I've got an agenda, and it's working through.
I'm just muscling my way in nicely.
Well, I mean, I'd wanted to do Maya Deren basically ever since we started doing the podcast. She was one of the filmmakers that I thought we have to get around to. Her stuff is important. But I'm also very, very conscious of the fact that it can be quite difficult for people to get into. And certainly my first responses to her work were... I said in the intro that you either end up bewildered or bewitched, and I think I went from one to the other pretty quickly. Do you remember how you first encountered her stuff and how you responded?
For sure. So, like yourself, I did a film degree at Queen's University, Belfast, which is where I first learned about Maya Deren. I did a module in my final year of my undergrad called Film and the Visual Arts. And so we watched some Maya Deren for that. And I remember doing an essay about oniric activity, so dream-like activity in these sorts of films. You mentioned surrealism earlier, and Maya Deren for a long time has been heralded as an American surrealist, and I think there's a lot of problems with that idea, so maybe that's something we'll tease out a bit later. But like yourself, I was very bewildered by it all. Not just really with Maya Deren. That was probably the more accessible of the work that we were shown in that module. A lot of it we felt just was really combative, and some of it is deliberately combative in the avant-garde.
That was an avant-garde module you were doing, so I'm assuming it's very similar to the avant-garde module I also did at Queen's.
Quite possibly.
Which was at times painful to get through.
It was definitely that. It was definitely really painful. And I mean, I don't like being negative about anybody, but it wasn't particularly taught well. And none of us had a good time, and you're not necessarily there to have a good time, but we all felt like we were in dire pain. It was excruciating, some of the screenings, and we just felt bereft of information. I actually felt like I would have been better just watching the films completely cold. Then the lectures weren't brilliant. And that now this is this was taught by somebody who's not at Queen's anymore, hasn't been for a very long time, and very, very nice person. But I didn't find them a particularly good teacher. And I think that was the bug that meant I was always curious about the avant-garde, and I never let it drop. That became something that was a real driving force in my own research, because I needed to understand it. I needed to conquer it and understand it better, navigate it a bit better. And then when I ended up getting my first full-time but fixed-term teaching post in University of Aberdeen, and actually, I had a practice run before. Actually, Desiree Raw, who's still at Queen's, he introduced me to just a wider way of looking at experimental film. A bit later on, when I was starting to teach myself, he was a really good mentor that way for me. And I had a much broader understanding of it after studying for my BA and MA. And it was when I started to teach myself and teach it to other students. And I just was determined to make this really difficult topic accessible to students. I didn't want any student to feel that absolute pain that we'd all gone through. I felt a real duty and a determination to get them to not necessarily enjoy it, but to access it and understand it in a way that just wasn't available to me when I was at their stage. So when I got the job at Aberdeen, my specialist module for the honours course, so in Scotland, they've got a 4-year degree, and for honours you do 4 years. So it was years 3 and 4 I was teaching together. And I did cinema and the American avant-garde. I looked specifically at North America and what was happening there in avant-garde filmmaking. Maya Deren is really central to that. She's a real driving force of any kind of movement that you can discern. Movement, again, is a problematic term, but it's, for want of a better word, we haven't really got one. It's one of those. And so it's just a way of accessing things. And so, yes, teaching her and the women who came along after her and were unable to buy what she had done, that was something I was really determined to start to cover. So that's my story with my intellectual connection with Maya Deren, if you like. So that was a really big long ramble for you to get us started off.
We're doing this as live. I'm not cutting any of this stuff out. It's all going in there, Paula.
That's why I'm making jokes, Robert. I need people to say I'm an agent as well as a really clever, serious woman.
So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of stuff to unpick. Now, normally whenever we're talking about a film, we'll talk about, its plotting, and then we'll kind of try and analyze it. But it strikes me that when we're talking about Maya Deren, that's kind of redundant to a large extent. I think, you've already picked up on the any association with surrealism is a complicated one when you're dealing with someone like Deren. And I'm instantly thinking back to our recent conversations we've had on the show about Jean Cocteau as somebody who, although some of his films are very definitely surrealist, insists he's not a surrealist. That it's not a surrealist film. And I know that Meshes has been, there's reference to Cocteau as being a possible influence in terms of Meshes, although Maya said that she'd never seen the film Blood of a Poet, and that was just purely coincidental. And then she watched it later and said, okay, right, I can see why you think that there's a connection, because we are in similar headspaces. So this sort of feels like a nice, anyone who's at home, who's listening to this, who's watching along with us. I like to think people actually watch along with the films that we suggest. I hope they do. But if they've just gone through Cocteau, to go to Maya Deren makes some sort of sense to me. But so Meshes in particular, why would we say that it is or isn't a surrealist film for you? What's the issue with that as a term?
So the issue is one of quite deep ingrained misogyny, to be quite frank about it. It's more a label that's been imposed upon her work by all the men. I mean, all the men. So Now, the bigger, broader context of all this is so early 1940s in the United States, as you said, young Maya. Well, she makes Meshes of the Afternoon, and in that same year, I think just to try and get a bit of context before we try and really delve into the surrealist stuff. So 1943 is a massive transformative year for her, because lots of stuff's happened in her life. Her father dies. She meets and collaborates with Alexander Hamid, who she made the film with, and he was a Czechoslovakian filmmaker working in Hollywood. They meet, they collaborate, they fall in love, they get married, they move back to New York after making that film. So Meshes is made in LA, in Los Angeles. And so they're in the backdrop of Hollywood. They're in Tinseltown, essentially, on the fringes, quite literally, of the center of power of filmmaking. And in the 1940s, especially at that time, you've also got emigre directors such as Alfred Hitchcock hasn't long moved over and started to make films. He's making Notorious. He will soon make Spellbound in 1945, which is very heavily influenced by surrealism and psychoanalysis. So 1940s US, especially in Hollywood, all the big film producers and the studio heads, they all become obsessed with Freudian psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis.
I can hear the sigh in your voice when you
it's
just
quite
thinking
boring.
about this. But I don't want to derail you in your flow, but I mean, I get the sense of like this frustration with the whole movement and the obsession that's coming.
It's the imposition of it on other people. So there were people who genuinely were doing that. The surrealists, and the bunch of them, the Europeans, were all centered around in France in the 1920s, and they were doing film as well as painting, writing, everything. They very much were directly engaging with that. Fine, fair enough. But then it gets imposed to other people because that becomes the dominant way of reading a film, because everybody decides, films are a bit like dreams, aren't they? So let's just apply psychoanalytic dream analysis to everything, and everything suddenly is a phallic symbol, and you can't move for phallic symbols in all these films. And sometimes a bread knife is just a bread knife. Do you know what I mean, Robert?
Somebody said that to me on Twitter the other night. I think it was in one of the Hammer conversations I was having, and I had deliberately taken a reading of the films as they're vampire films and talking about them in terms of kink.
Oh yes,
and it just like once I applied that reading onto it, I couldn't help but see the stuff there. And someone basically made that comment that a bread knife is just a bread knife. Sometimes it's like, yeah, sometimes it is, but also sometimes it's fun to sort of to think about like, what if this isn't? And like so I mean, whilst I have ostensibly linked this in with surrealism and dreamscapes, I suppose I should make it clear that for me, I don't necessarily see Meshes and Atland and her other films as dream representations, but as that sort of altered reality, as that sort of subconscious, as something else that's not what we traditionally see.
Yes.
And dreamscape rather than dreams. I mean, in the sense of something that's slightly more ethereal or weird or altered. There's just not. It's very hard to find a label for it, and whenever
it is.
I think that's where terms like avant-garde start getting used, and then avant-garde possibly because
that's even a problem, yeah.
Possibly because of that module I did at uni. I sort of have a resistance to avant-garde as a term.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yes, but that for me has always been quite a cutting term. It's quite, and I think it limits some of these films to end up being like it's somewhere out there rather than actually this is a great piece of art.
Exactly, yeah.
So I mean that's my own prejudice coming to the fore, and just so the you're aware, but
Yeah, it's good to lay all that stuff out, though. I think that's important because it does cloud, because if we're trying to present this to quite a general viewership, say a potential viewership of people who don't have that formal film education that we've had, we just want to say, like, this is a really interesting 15 minutes. It's just really interesting. It's really gorgeous. She is stunningly beautiful. She's captivating.
yeah.
It's just a really interesting thing. There's not really any story in her films. There's just a sequence of events that happen. And Meshes, I think there is quite a strong implication that the woman, there's no names, there's no characters, there's no actors who are credited in her films. That's really important to note, actually. But the woman who is played by Deren herself, this woman character who's not necessarily Deren, but it's just the woman in the film. There is an implication that she goes through the routine of she comes home, there's stuff around the house, you see her in the domestic space, she sits down, she falls asleep. Then you see a repetition, but quite a distorted repetition of the same sequence of events. Then another distortion of the same sequence of events, and then it goes like that. So it goes a bit like the Inception thing of you're jumping down through, as you say, dreamscapes. But that's the only one of her films where there's any implication that there is a dream that you're seeing. But I think what you said about altered realities, that's really important because her whole thing is reality and what is cinema, what is cinema capable of doing to reality. And she, again, for your listeners, for your viewers, she was a film theorist as well as a filmmaker. And she was writing about concepts that much later male white theorists and philosophers, and not necessarily film ones, but were publishing about her ideas she was having in the 1940s, 50s, and prior to her death in 1961. She was publishing about these ideas in a really accessible way. Her writing is actually really accessible and enjoyable to read. And she was coming up with ideas about what cinema's function actually can be and what you can do with it and what it can do with reality, the power of cinematography and editing to give us a different way of seeing reality. That's really what she was experimenting with. She's not trying to say, well, me taking a key out of my mouth instead of out of a purse is a sexual thing. She's not, that's when the viewer is imposing something on the images that she's creating rather than, and I'm not usually one to shout out for authorial intent. I think, I'm a sort of Barthesian school of the author is dead, long live the viewer or the reader. But in her case, I think the reception to her work has been so clouded by this overbearing insistence that we psychoanalyze her work and that there's meaning in the images rather than that there's meaning in the montage. So I think there's just really interesting work trying to reclaim that a bit. I think just reading her own work is so fascinating, especially if you do have a formal education and you've heard of philosophers like Gilles Deleuze, who, was a philosopher about other stuff, who wrote 2 books about cinema, the movement image and the time image. I mean, that's two volumes, 2 books. She sums that up in this one article published in 1961, right? Just a few pages of a journal article in Daedalus in 1961. 1960, published just less than a year before her death in 1961. She basically outlines everything that's said in a more straightforward way, an accessible way, than he takes 2 books to do in French, floaty, hand-wavy French. So Sorry to be rude, but
I didn't know you were so down on the French.
I'm not. I'm not at all. It's just, it's one of those things where, again, as a film student,
Mm-hmm.
you're told, it's insisted upon you that these theorists and philosophers, their word is God, and you have to accept their genius.
I could
And
never get
then,
into Deleuze at all.
oh, again, it's painful. Right.
um,
And I got really into Toulouse. In my master's, I was, framework and all over the place with his stuff, right?
uh-huh.
But then left it alone for a bit, did a PhD, but got a bit older, a bit more life experience, had to teach in a university where they were still obsessed with Deleuze, and had to revisit it all again. I was reading it going, what does this even mean? What are you saying? You're taking a paragraph to say something you could say in 3 words, mate. Come on here.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's that frustrating. And then again, I just read that article by Deren the other day. I should tell you the title of it actually if you want to find it.
Please do.
It's cinematography, the creative use of reality, right? And that whole article, look, it's so fascinating, Robert. It's like getting into a warm bath just reading her writing. Honestly, it's
I
lovely.
have it in my essential Deren book, and I think
Yeah,
I've another Deren book sitting around somewhere.
yeah,
Like these are like for me, her work. I found her work so interesting and what she had to say interesting as a student. So beyond whatever we were talked about in the class, the images captivated me.
mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I'd forgotten how beautiful she was until I was rewatching her films this week. And
Yeah,
this is somebody who has the looks of someone that could have been a star,
yeah,
that could have captivated in mainstream films without any
yeah.
bother. And at that point, I was one of those students who went off and bought all the books as an undergrad because I wanted to read more about what was going on. But I'm completely happy to take on that notion that surrealism is something that we've sort of assigned to her, perhaps erroneously. And I get that psychoanalysis is a deeply problematic
Mm,
way of encountering cinema. And the problem is it's like quite an easy, lazy way of doing
I
it
think
as well
so,
at
yeah.
times. And I can understand why people like Cocteau and Deren are like, well, it's sometimes a bit interesting to hear what someone thinks of my work, but this isn't what I'm doing.
Exactly,
She
yeah.
talks about experience in the same way that Cocteau talks about experience. And I feel personally that when I watch her films, I've experienced something. What I don't always understand is what it is that I'm feeling or
Mm-hmm.
why it is that I'm feeling. And I guess that is the montage.
Yes. See, if we think about what you were saying about the idea of ritual and what I had mentioned about if you describe meshes, if you render it right down, it's repetitive actions.
Mm.
Okay, and that's essentially what ritual is.
Yeah.
If you find her work, and a lot of it is quite out there on the internet and everything, and it is very short. It's all about repeated actions, and she more and more moves over into dance films. She was a semi-professional dancer, and so movement is hugely important, and it's gesture, action. Words aren't important. All her
Mm.
films are silent. There maybe later versions of her films that have an added music soundtrack by
Mm-hmm.
her third husband, TJ. What is it? TJ Ito. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but he was a musician, and they, re-released some of her films with his soundtrack. So there are two versions of Meshes of the Afternoon, for example.
Mm-hmm.
One that's completely silent, no sound at all, and the other. And I mean, I suppose actually it's worth pointing out to people these very experimental films. They wouldn't have been shown in a conventional cinema the way you'd see a usual film. You would have been in the room probably with the projector, so actually the noise of a film projector ticking over was part of the experience. The flicker of the light in the room
Mm-hmm.
with you was part of the experience. So, and you might have been watching this in a space in a house, or a community center room or something like that. They were showing these things wherever they could get a space. So you have to take yourself out of the conventional viewing space, if you like.
I mean, rewatching stuff last night. that silence of the films really struck me in a way that I think I was reminded then of why it was initially I found some of the stuff quite bewildering but also quite hypnotic, because there's something deeply uncomfortable. I sat with my headphones on last night watching this, listening to nothing, and there was something quite disturbing about watching a 15-minute film, even a 15-minute film with no sound, because we're so caught up with this idea that film is accompanied by a score, that it's accompanied by dialogue. You see people acting within her films, but you don't hear them. The exception is Divine Horseman, which has a commentary track, but Divine Horseman was edited after she died, so it kind of doesn't count.
Yeah.
So like I find that quite uneasy. I think that's the thing. Uneasy is maybe the thing that I feel about watching her films. So that silence, that ritual, the presence of the presence of witchcraft and voodoo that becomes increasingly apparent as you go through her work, adds this really, I want to say uncanny, but then I know if I say uncanny, we are getting back into surrealism and Freudianism, and that's not where we want to go. But there is that something discomforting about it for me. I mean, how do you respond to it? It's not about what you're taught, but how do you feel whenever you watch these films?
I feel curious, to be honest, because I'm drawn to how she achieves the effects that she does, because there is something very odd and disconcerting about in Atland. The very first thing you see is the sea rolling backwards, it's backward motion. She uses slow motion, she uses stop motion, she uses quite a lot of canted framings. She records everything as it is in front of the camera. So that's your sense of reality. There's no special effects in there. Everything is as it is. It's just, how is the camera moving? How is it recording anything? How has she put the shots together in the edit? That's the thing that makes it seem a bit unreal. And then it's that married up with the gestures, because she takes quite ordinary everyday gestures but puts them in a strange place. So she's trying to get some, a lot of times she's trying to get somewhere. It's about moving through space. And then that's very much connected with our experience of time passing. So it's spatiality and duration, is what we're thinking about. So it's the character. When we say her, we mean the character that she's playing. It's how is that person moving through space and negotiating with space? What kind of space is it? Is it domestic? Is it outdoors? Is it on a street? Is it on a beach? Is it finding herself crawling across this table where there are all these upper class people drinking and smoking and chatting and not seeming to notice her crawling across the table, because even just to crawl, it's maybe not something that ordinary for an adult. But if you think about, well, when would you crawl in your domestic space if you're trying to find something that you've dropped, or if you're trying to get at something awkward on the floor, it's actually quite an ordinary thing to do in certain circumstances. But it's something that she performs. She takes it out of its ordinary circumstances and performs it in this odd way. You wouldn't do it on top of a dinner table, but you would do it if you're trying to find something you dropped on the floor. Do you know what I mean? So so these odd situations come from actually quite everyday rituals that we would partake in. And then, as you say, it increasingly, as her films progress, she develops more and more her interests in in voodoo, voodoo rituals. But she also goes back more to dance, her interest in dance. And she actually is less and less appearing in her films. Other people are appearing in her films, and other people, because she becomes increasingly more networked with people, actually. Her very first film is her and Alexander Hamid, because they're the only two people I know doing this stuff. So they just try it out. It's one of those films, but like the sort of Orson Welles, Citizen Kane, let's just have a go, lads. And then that's the one you're getting remembered for. But actually her later films are much more complex, they're involving a lot more people. She gets more networked. So there's more and more of a community. So I suppose, well, that's again, I'm not necessarily directly answering your question, but as I say, it's curious and I want to find out about these things. So you start breaking it down. And I think when you're free of phallic symbols and the surrealist imposition on her films, you start to think about, actually, there's something really interesting going here with the passage of time and how she depicts that, and how we use moving through space as a marker of passing through time. And then what happens when she calls it telescoping. You use the camera like a telescope to on time, right? So you use slow motion to really study the movement. And what is movement? Well, it's a way of moving through time as well as space. So by stretching the time, you can really study the way the movement is happening. And that's coming from that very modernist, and she is very broadly modernist. So, I mean, that idea of the avant-garde being quite a problematic term, very broadly, this is definitely of the modernist tradition, say. Where there were experiments in the very early days of cinema, there were experiments in painting and photography with, well, how do we depict movement in a still image? She's in a way going back to that, where she's slowing down the speed of the image so that you can really study how the movements are. So when you, in Meshes, when she's running up the stairs, it's in slow motion. When she's at that land, when she's pulling herself up the deadwood, it's in slow motion. She can really study the gestures that her body's making. So, when you look at it that way, actually there's something a bit deeper. There's something more philosophical going about how humans experience space and time, and the cinema can reveal things about that. And that's what she's getting at, and I think that's what cracked it for me, is when I really studied her writing and got a handle on that, and just totally ignored all the, you still can psychoanalyze, you can still, absolutely, there's enough material in there. But for me, it's been more interesting to look at how she works with space and time, how she uses the technology and the techniques. What shots does she put together to create, and it's montage editing, as opposed to just when we say edit, it's this shot beside that shot. Whereas she will do montage to create a different meaning. So this shot with that shot, we mean take really, but they can mean something bigger than the two of them separately, is the idea of montage, if that sort of makes sense. But that's where you start to get the match cutting, the match on action, but across different spaces. But they have unity in movement, and that unity in movement gives them unity in time. So you'll see her arms start to move, and then it will cut to a shot where her hand comes into the frame, and her hand's in a different location from where you first saw her arm. And that she develops that happens in a very small way in Meshes, where she's walking. So there's a close up on her feet, and she's on a beach, then she's on the street, then she's stepping up the stairs. That's developed a lot more in Atland, and it happens again in Ritual and Transfigured Time, in choreography for cinema, where there's this transposition of the body, but the body is fluid and moving through space. It's the sort of thing that you do that now with green screen, and you would film the dancer or the actor all in one go, and then you'd, through CGI, change their backdrop. But she was doing that by re-performance. So again, back to ritual, back to repeated action, back to how you build community through repeated action and community through voodooistic ritual. So it's coming back to, she argues it in her anagram. She argues that what she's trying to achieve, and her anagram was published in 1946, so she's thinking about this stuff very seriously, very early. She's saying, like, yes, absolutely, you can you can, there is something definitely psychological going on. She doesn't deny that. But what she's saying is the psychology of it is actually the psychology of something deeper, what it is to be human rather than what it is to be me. It's what it is to have community and together have repeated actions, and what are the implications of those repeated actions on just how we live our lives. It's bigger questions. It's part of being something bigger than yourself rather than just obsessed with yourself. The egotism of psychoanalysis, I think, is what she's getting at. And that has brought it alive for me in ways that psychoanalytical readings just make me nod off, to be honest.
I mean, thinking about it, there's lots there to potentially pick apart and to discuss, but I had completely forgotten about those psychoanalytical readings of Meshes when I was watching it. So when I was looking at the key and the knife that appear in that, I literally saw them as a key and a knife. I didn't think it was time to unlock. Now, there's a couple of shots where she's caressing her own body.
Oh, yeah.
And there's the partners caressing her. Now, that strikes me as obviously sexual, but I hadn't necessarily read a sexual undertone into everything else, because it seems to end up, that whole film, it ends, it seems, in a suicide. So for me, the knife is about murderous intent. It's, that's tied in with that kind of violence, but I guess it's also representative of cutting. This is film, so you can't help but draw a parallel between the razor blade that you use to splice your film and a knife within a film that's very heavily reliant on those cuts. But that's my kind of response to it. At Land is I mean, I find the film's quite trippy, I think, is the only word that really sums it up. So for anyone who's not familiar with their work and's going, this is a bit dry for me, they are quite trippy experiences in the right frame of mind. They're worth indulging in to see where it takes you. And there's something about those juxtapositions, about those cuts in Atland, that have me thinking about the way that comedy ended up working for certain artists in like the 50s and 60s. It's like something you could see Spike Milligan doing for comic effect, to jump between, climbing up a piece of wood on a beach and then suddenly like a child peering over the edge of a table before you then go and crawl across it. Like that is it makes no sense, but it does make a sense, and there's something there. And I think our desire to try and find meaning and sense of everything is to lose a sense of actually what's going on, to how it's making you feel, and to there is something else that's at play. And you mentioned egotism as well, and about the egotism of the sort of the surrealism and the Freudian readings and all the rest of it. And there is something about her removing herself from her films as a physical presence that strikes me as non-egotistical. And again, you said it first, it's like she was an incredibly beautiful person who the camera loves. And that just seems so odd to have that, to be like in our 21st century mindset, in a filmmaking kind of context, to have someone that is physically attractive to the camera, to the viewer, to be building on their body of work and removing themselves from that. But then that possibly is where, I don't know how much the biography of Maya Deren's life influences that, because I know that her final years were not happy necessarily. Like, she did not end her days in a great place. So is there some sort of element of withdrawing from those expectations, from that male gaze in a way, and also dealing with potentially elements of self-loathing, body dysmorphia? I don't know. I just feel, or at least it feels like there's some sort of conversation potential in that. I don't know.
Well, I think what you pointed out actually about the end of Meshes is already really important, because there's a really violent denial and refusal to give in to the male gaze. And this is before people have really formalized a term for that. But it's already very much happening. Because the end of the last sequence of the film is the idea that the partner, so Alexander Hamid, turns up at their home, and we don't know if what we've just seen is the last fitful dreams of the woman, but he's turned up, and what he witnesses is her in a chair, and she's very violently cut up and dead, and she's sliced up. She's her face is disfigured. She's taken the beauty away, and she's taken access to her body away. So there's already that denial, and it's not I'm just refusing you, I don't consent to this. It's I'm going to mess this up. You're not even going to get a pretty image out of my death. So I think though she's already working through a lot of that stuff, whether she even realized it or not. But I think she was, her master's degree was in English literature and poetic symbolism. So I have a feeling she knew what she was doing. She was very deliberate about the stuff. I think she really knew her stuff. She was incredibly intelligent, and I don't know too much about the biography of her later life. As far as I'm aware, she died of multiple brain hemorrhages. What led to that, I don't really know. But I know that when she moved back to New York, she was central to such a massive network of people, and she enabled people, and there was community built around her, and she was a driving force of promoting experimental cinema and just the arts in general. She was a real champion of the arts. The people around her were women who were artists of all kinds. She was friends with Phoebe Barron, who was one of the partnership who I think they won an Oscar for their soundtrack for Forbidden Planet, the electronic soundtrack in that, and they went on to collaborate then with filmmakers like Shirley Clarke, who came up after Maya Deren, and probably wouldn't have had so much of a start only for Maya Deren paving the way. Joyce Wieland as well, who was married to Michael Snow. Mark Snow is a totally different person who wrote the theme tune for the X-Files. It's always in my brain. And
prove your nerd credentials.
Happily. So, the huge amounts of people, there's a massive network, because we think about New York in the mid 20th century, and we maybe think about Andy Warhol's factory. Okay, this is well before all of that. This was late 1940s all the way through the 1950s. This is well before all of that, and a lot of the younger ones who came up through their association with Maya Deren ended up as part of Andy Warhol's troupe. She was galvanic, and she was a real promoter. What's really interesting, the paradox of her is that she's very anti-commercialism. So it's not that she was uncommercial, she was actively anti-commercial. And so it was arts for everybody type thing, but she fiercely promoted it, and she wanted everybody to see it. So she was marketing, she was promoting, but not in a commercial way. She was making things happen as much as possible. She would have wild parties in her house. She would start spontaneously dancing. She, descriptions of her wearing, very loose bohemian clothes, and her hair was wild, and she had cats everywhere, and everybody was welcome. Her house was your house, and she just wanted everything to be alive with creativity. That's as much as I know about her biography. I haven't read too much about exactly what was going on in her later life. She had quite a few marriages in a short space of time. But again, I know relatively little about that because I am a nerd, and it's the give me all the juicy film aesthetic stuff, please, is my interest.
Biography matters nothing.
Matters a bit, but it's not my main thing.
I mean, I was aware of, so reading up what little I could, I mean, I was aware that there was a brain hemorrhage that she died of at a very early age.
Yeah.
But that was partly contributed to by malnutrition.
Yeah.
When you hear that, I mean, without being able to explore much more about that, the suggestion or the inference that I get from that is either she's in poverty and not looking after herself, or, you know, there's something else psychological that is, which why I suggest things like body dysmorphia and things like this, and knowing that she's withdrawing from a screen presence. Trying to find photographs of her is ridiculously hard. I mean, I was looking for stuff, and everything I see is the publicity for those 3 or 4 films that she makes in the 1940s. There's very little beyond that, which again strikes me as odd for someone who is a visual artist. And there's also something, I think another one of the reasons I'm attracted to her work is that she is somebody who doesn't finish stuff. It's like Orson Welles and myself. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm like Orson Welles or Maya Deren, other than I have far too many projects that never get completed and nobody gets to see.
Yeah.
So we have these bunch of films and snippets of things that she was working on for years that have never seen fruition. And there's something about that mindset as well that I find fascinating, particularly because she's clearly a very savvy individual who has very clear ideas about what her cinema should be doing, and yet we're deprived of having more of it because she doesn't finish the stuff that she's doing.
Because I wonder if this is a legacy of not, you know, we're only really learning properly about conditions such as ADHD and autism. You know, that that's only starting to become more nuanced now.
Yeah.
And what if it's something like that? What if it's an ability to just focus on something for long enough? Or is there, you know, have there been economic factors that mean that you can't complete? Because just thinking that, because that's what I'm in at the minute. It's like I'm so worried about when's the next paid gig coming that I can't settle into just, right, let's just do that big project I've been planning for 5 years, you know. So as well as, is there neurodivergence at play, or, you know, any other kind of factors? Because I mean, I don't want to psychologize her because I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, I'm having to rely on the historians in the States who can access the archives and have the testimonies of people who knew her. But, you know, can we ever really know?
Well, I mean, if somebody happens to be listening or watching this and has some answers or more insight into this, like, please do get in touch. I guess it's the thing for me is about things like this, things like knowing that we are left with a fragmented body of work, make me reflect on that. And I guess they make me reflect on myself. It's part of the experience for me. You know, watching her films makes me feel a particular way. That's my, you know, emotional, intellectual response to her cinema prompts a certain reaction from me. But then looking at her work and then trying to look into more of her work and finding out that it feels like there's gaps. Like you're sitting there wondering, why did Divine Horseman not get shot and not get finished? Because, you know, she goes off to Haiti for 18 months. She's given a whack load of money to go and do this filming, and she does it, and she comes back with the footage. And it sits for 15 years, you know, and then she dies. And like it strikes me there's something else going on, or something like Witch's Cradle, which again I was watching yesterday, which was done as part of an exhibition. I think it was the Guggenheim were behind that one. And it's a really interesting stuff. It's packed full of beautiful, I mean, for anyone who's a kind of occulty goth out there, it's packed full of lovely occulty gothy kind of visuals and a lot of repetitions. And it is again quite hypnotic and quite fascinating. But I'm also aware that it's not a finished piece of work. And I don't know, there is something fascinating about seeing a work in progress. And that the thing that has been made public is the work in progress, not the signed, sealed, this is the final version of. And so while I get quite precious about like re-editing and reversioning things at times, but there's almost an invitation within that to try and do something more to kind of, I mean, is this part of her democratization of the work? I don't know. But these are the questions that I start asking myself. This is how I'm responding to it.
They're good questions, yeah. Always keep them wanting. Always keep them wanting something, right? And it's interesting. She was fascinated by mythology as well, and she
Mm,
herself has become legendary. She has become. It's the idea of Maya Deren that we talk about, and even just the changing of her name to Maya and the implications of what that name means. And it means different things in lots of different languages and different mythologies and things. There's a Greek messenger who's called Maya, in the ancient mythologies. There's means mother in, I think, Sanskrit. There's a meaning of it in Buddhism. I think it's illusion, something like that. She uses all these things. She's quite carefully creating a persona of
mm,
Maya Deren around herself. She's not Eleonora anymore, and she's she in her life performs, I think, quite a lot. With the
mm.
parties and the way she dresses, the bohemian lifestyle, the different marriages. There is a performance of Maya Deren that I imagine must have happened like we all do, but it's exaggerated. At what point does it tip over into camp, and at what point, do we believe what's been passed down about her stories because there's even legends about her, as
Mm-hmm.
well as what's actual history about her, and so I think part of the mystery is in a way, part of the tragic fun of it, to put it in a weird way. I suppose that's my response to. I think you're asking really, really good, pertinent questions.
Mm.
I don't know if any of us can ever have a definitive answer.
No, and I don't necessarily know that I want an answer for them
Yeah, it's
either.
more interesting to speculate and imagine.
And it is about, I mean, for me, a lot about film, a lot about art is about how then we respond as individuals to it, and it's about what it reveals in ourselves. And I feel that something along the line here, I'm watching her films and experiencing her films, enlightens some aspect of my life, and I would hope that other people are similarly enlightened about their own. The one thing I don't want to leave our pod today without touching on is her nationality. Now, for folks who are listening or watching who maybe think I'm making a deliberately political move, it's the 4th of March as we record this, 2022, and I realise that we are discussing a fantastic female filmmaker who is is from Ukraine, the very week that Ukraine is getting blown to bits by Russia. And that was not a deliberate intention. We discussed about doing this
Quite a while ago. Yeah,
before Putin invaded.
Exactly.
And it fits within the terms for anyone who's watching and listening to the stuff regularly will know that this fits in with everything else that we're doing at the moment. But it strikes me that there is something possibly there to be teased out about our nationality. I mean, when you're talking about montage, I mean, I think about the works of Eisenstein and Vertov and people like that who are doing this amazing montage work that's very cinematic cinema.
Yes.
And she seems to be continuing and evolving that and shaping into something different again. But so she's born in April 1917, just before Ukraine becomes a state in its own right. So it's still part of Russia, becomes Ukraine very, very quickly. So she's Ukrainian, then she moves over to America when she's 5. But from everything I've seen and read about her, she was still very connected with her Russian origins. Not connected with her Jewish faith that she was born into, and really in any way, shape, or form. She didn't talk about it. She didn't want to get involved with it. She was more interested in voodoo.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But her parents, I think, left Ukraine because of anti-Semitism.
Because of the pogroms, yeah.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is something just to be aware of, and I think that it is fascinating. But how much does that Sovietness, I think, come through in her work? I mean, do you have any sort of sense of that, or?
Well, it's interesting because she's born and she's a young child at the time when those experiments were happening, and to be honest, I mean, I think that a lot of, say, Eisenstein's films were probably getting over to the States, but I don't know exactly when. And because we're talking about that interwar period as well in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, I don't know enough about that period of cinema to know about what was circulating where and who would have been aware of what. And but she did go to school. She did go as a teenager. She did go back to Europe to go to school. Her parents divorced when she was quite young, and her life did become split between Europe and the United States. And she studied, I think, in Switzerland. I'm not 100%, but she did have that connection back to Europe, and there would have been a lot of circulation of cinema then. It's quite possible that she might have encountered it, but as a teenage girl, would she have been watching Eisenstein? I really don't know. Would anybody? I don't know.
Given a choice.
So, I mean, I think it's all interesting to just lay out there, and then if people are interested in poking at those questions, then go for it. But I think that's a really good thing to point out, actually, is that she probably is part of a lineage, whether she knows it or not. And I mean, even but I suppose so, in as I mentioned a little bit earlier, a lot of these techniques were already maybe coming through in quite small ways in Hollywood and the mainstream, because I mean, the likes of, again, Hitchcock trained in Germany in the Weimar period in Germany, and picked up a lot from German expressionism, and that really comes through a lot in his films. And he was very semi-literate and aware. So in the mainstream, the jobbing directors who were hired by studios, because it was all very different back then, it was the studios hired you and you did what you were told. And then you find a way to be artistic within all of that, and that's not the only example. There were huge amounts of emigre directors coming over during these years because of the problems in Europe at the time. It all started much earlier than sort of the late 30s. It was all happening, already in the 20s, and people were fleeing, because they could see, a lot of them could see what was coming. But yeah, so I think it's definitely important to just point out, and there could be something in that for sure. But experiments with editing to create meaning weren't exclusive either to the Soviet Union. So yeah, I mean, and also it wasn't just Eisenstein. People like Dziga Vertov and his brothers, were all working on that. And actually, it was his wife was doing a lot of the editing for their films, and so on and so forth. Whole other thing. That's another thread for you to go off on.
That's one we're going to be exploring at some point. I keep threatening the rest of the team that you're getting some Soviet film at some point.
Man with the movie camera is fascinating. I love it.
It's my favorite film of all time.
So great, so great. It's fundamental,
and feels very fresh and modern.
Yeah.
Even 100 years later.
Yes.
But then that's, I suppose, what I love about a lot of this film. That's what I love about this. The fact that her work is silent.
Yeah.
Makes it almost, I won't say transcendental, but I don't think that's the word I'm actually looking for. It is something that's able to cross barriers in a way that, if you stick a dialogue on it, you code it in a particular way, in a particular language. And so it's more universal.
Yeah, and you can screen it in a way that you could put whatever music you wanted to. If you have a look on YouTube, because people put our films up on YouTube all the time, there are people who have created their own scores for Maya Deren's films, and I haven't really bothered listening to any of those because I just think there's a massive issue there with copyright and stuff, but I don't know. But people are exploring their creativity, and maybe she'd be quite open to that as long as they weren't commercializing her work. I but not 100%. But people do that. They make up their own scores for films that were never intended to have scores. Atland, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, never had a score imposed on it by her. Mesh is dead. It was released. The original version is 1943, and then in 1953 she has by then married TJ Ito, and his score. The film was re-released with his score on it. So have you listened to that one? Have you listened to
I
that?
haven't. I sort of deliberately went to as early a version as I could find for this stuff. So
Yeah.
I've listened to the pure stuff. I've heard some of his other things. Because I know he did a lot of other music as well. Um, I was watching one of the films that actually has a score last night as well, and it sort of threw me, the fact that after sitting in silence for an hour, to then suddenly go, there's sound, and then sound is obviously part of an emotional part of the experience. I think what stripping of a score allows you to do is to imprint your own sense of self on it.
Yeah, definitely.
In a way that you're not being led in quite the same way. Because we all respond to images differently. And I guess that's why some people see a knife as something else rather than just a knife. Because that's their response.
Yeah. But the scores are the intended scores anyway. They're quite pared back because there's a lot of minimalism going on. So if you think about the avant-garde or experimentalism in music in the mid 20th century, you've got people like John Cage, who I think was, part of that circle of people who knew Maya Deren. So they'd certainly have been aware of each other. And so you're talking really minimalistic, pared back, a beat occasionally, sort of drawn out jazz almost. So maybe bongo drums used very sparingly, and clarinets, oboes, again tones from those used quite sparingly, then maybe a little flurry of something, and then silence, and then it's quite staccatoed and spaced out, and then a bit of action, and then quiet again, and it's something sort of, again, curious, intriguing about it. And when there's action happening, so if you imagine in meshes where it seems like the house is rolling around, and it's Deren is doing all these contorted stretches and things, and the camera's just doing really interesting movements at canted angles. I mean, there's no special effect there. It's all them. I mean, I've been watching a lot of original series Star Trek, and they're having to pretend to shake, and it's just like, oh lads, you have no idea. Like, you need to watch some Maya Deren because she makes a house look like it's rolling around just by these quite simple techniques, and it looks real. But yeah, when that sort of stuff happens, the music will get really urgent, and stuff's happening, and then I'll calm down again. So, the music's a bit like that, but it is quite pared back. So I don't know, it's maybe worth giving it a go. But
I'll give it an explore later if I can find it.
Yeah, but I do prefer the silent. To be honest, I find the music is intrusive and leading, as you say. It's nice to just, how am I feeling today? What am I bringing to this today? And just really concentrate on what you're seeing, as well as what you're seeing, how that makes you react. So yeah, but it's interesting to do both.
Any final thoughts?
Too many. Too many. There's just so more. Like I think these are they're short, but they're quite complex films. They're really interesting films, as you say. They're very beautiful films, and they're mercifully short. There's a lot of avant-garde cinema that is not merciful in any way. It's super long. It's super painful. This is the most accessible way to dip your toe into experimental artists' cinema if you have been just not interested in engaging with that. I think Maya Deren is the place to just ease you into that. It's really fascinating.
I think it's a fairly decent summary. I mean, as I said at the start, she's someone who I have found initially bewildering and then was bewitched by. And the more that I've explored her work, the more interested I've become. And I don't always connect with it. I mean, there are days where I watch her films and I feel very disengaged and cold. And that may in part be the fact that there isn't a soundtrack to set my mood. So maybe I should just stick some headphones on next time and play something else while I'm watching them. But
yeah, they don't tell you how to feel.
no, but her imagery is stunning imagery that's used. Her use of the camera is fantastic. Her technique is fascinating. As a presence, she has an abundance of it. And, you know, I'm also happen to be quite fond of sort of the macabre, and there's a healthy element of that in it, and I'm fascinated by the stuff about witchcraft and voodoo. And then she also writes, and her books her writing is well worth, I think there's two books that she wrote plus a number of essays which have been collected a couple of times. So she's someone who's worth exploring at the same time. And if you get into meshes, and if you happen to be, you know, watch it for the first time and you're interested in reading some of her stuff, her essay Cinema as an Art Form was one that she wrote just after completing meshes, and side by side they may give you a better in than we can do in the course of this podcast, but hopefully, you know, folks are interested. You know, we get so bogged down with traditional narrative storytelling, we get so bogged down with feature films and with the studio system. She is somebody who's far away from that. And as you said somewhere earlier, you know, she's someone who democratizes the cinema experience, and she's interested in encouraging other people to pick up a camera and experiment. And I have to say, in the same way that I was watching Cocteau in the last few weeks and feeling inspired by Cocteau, rewatching Maya Deren's work has made me want to take my camera back out and shoot some new stuff.
Oh, that's good.
Whether I do or not is another question entirely, but I feel right now that I could do something, and that a lot more is valid than we sometimes think.
I think so, yeah.
So, Paula, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Anything do you want to plug anything before you go?
I just want to say a really big thank you. I have been wanting to do something like this with you for ages, and I hope it's been really interesting for people. I really hope we can do something like this again, and love to have you on Audiovisual Cultures, which is available on all good podcast platforms, and is excellent, I must say, even if I make it myself. And I love CinePunked, big fan. And yeah, just really love this. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure, thank you. And I think sort of, you know, you someone who's taught these films at university, so you have an insight and a way of dealing with it then that I wouldn't have thought about approaching. You know the subject well, so I'm glad to have that insight as well, and to help us navigate and hopefully just tinkle somebody's taste buds and get them to go out and try something new. Folks, if you've enjoyed the podcast, tell your friends. You know the score by now. Like, subscribe. You'll find us on all good podcast platforms. If you just stumbled upon this for the first time, hit the subscribe button on whatever you're on, and check us out in future. You can get all our stuff on our website as well, cinepunked.com, and we're on various social media platforms. Do check us out. We'll be back in your ears and eyes again very soon. Paul, thank you very much. Folks at home, thank you very much as well.
Woo!